Today, we are diving straight into the incredibly tense and escalating conflict between the US, Israel, and Iran. The talk is getting tougher, the military strikes are getting more intense, and honestly, the stakes for the whole world just couldn't be any higher. So let's get right into it. And when I say the talk is tough, I mean this quote, attributed to Donald Trump, really sets the tone. It tells you everything you need to know about the severity of the situation. This isn't just political posturing. It's the kind of aggressive thinking that has really defined one side of this conflict from the very beginning.
But here's the thing. This isn't just a war of words. Not by a long shot. These threats are being backed up by a very real, very destructive cycle of military attacks that are playing out all across the region.
To give you a sense of the sheer scale of this, just look at this number. Over 12,000. That's how many targets U.S. and Israeli forces claim to have hit, according to U.S. Central Command. The volume of these strikes is, well, it's just staggering.
And it's not just the number of targets, it's the kind of targets that's really alarming. The source material we're looking at reports strikes on more than just military sites. We're talking about critical infrastructure, steel plants, airports, even a century-old medical research center. Then you see mosques, other civilian targets, and there are even reports of a passenger plane being hit.
Of course, this is very much a tit-for-tat situation. In response, Iran and its allies have launched their own coordinated strikes, and they've gone after some really high-value objectives. That includes Israeli ports and military sites, what's been described as the Mossad headquarters in Haifa, U.S. bases, and even tech infrastructure like Amazon data centers. They also reportedly took down a super expensive U.S. surveillance plane, one that costs around $800 million.
Okay, so beyond the actual battlefield, this conflict is also being fought as a war of words, and the way each side is talking about it is completely different. It tells you so much about their strategies.
So on one hand, you have this very aggressive victory lap kind of rhetoric. You get phrases like bomb them to the Stone Age. But that's in stark contrast to the approach from Iran's president. He's trying a totally different tactic, writing an open letter directly to the American people, trying to frame Iran's side of the story through its long history and pointing to past grievances with the U.S.
And if we dig into that letter, Iran is making some pretty specific points. It claims that it's never started a war. It points to domestic progress, like how its literacy rate has jumped from 30% to 90%. It also brings up history, reminding everyone that the U.S. supported Saddam Hussein when he used chemical weapons against them. And then it asks some very pointed questions, like whether the U.S. government is really putting America first, and it argues that Israel wants this conflict fought to the last American soldier.
You know, this conflict isn't just happening in a bubble. The shockwaves are spreading, and they're putting a real strain on some very old international alliances, especially between the U.S. and its partners in Europe.
And some of the analysis is pretty blunt. Political scientist John Mearsheimer says that as a meaningful military alliance, NATO is effectively dead. That is a huge statement. It really points to a deep, deep division in that alliance, especially with reports that Europe wasn't even consulted before the war began.
And the pressure on these alliances is just immense. The U.S. has reportedly given European allies an ultimatum: either send warships to the Strait of Hormuz, or you could risk losing American weapons aid for Ukraine. Think about that for a second. It connects two huge global conflicts and puts European leaders in a really, really tough spot.
But in the middle of all this escalation, something really unexpected seems to be happening. Some of the most aggressive voices, the ones who have been pushing for a hard line against Iran for years, are now hinting that maybe it's time to find an off-ramp.
I mean, just take a look at this statement from Lindsey Graham. He's famous for being a foreign policy hawk. So for him to come out and say, we need to wind down the war in Iran, well, that's a pretty big shift. When the biggest cheerleaders for war start looking for an exit, it really makes you wonder how things are actually going on the ground.
And we're seeing a similar kind of message from Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. When he says the threat is no longer existential, that one word changes everything. It creates diplomatic breathing room. It seems like both of these statements are trying to build a narrative, a way to de-escalate while still saving face, basically declaring the mission accomplished even while the fight is still going on.
But just walking away is not that simple. And that's because Iran holds one massive piece of leverage: its control over the Strait of Hormuz. We're talking about the choke point where a huge percentage of the world's oil has to pass through.
And the ripple effects from shutting down that waterway are already being felt. Big airlines like Lufthansa are reporting fuel shortages. Countries like Malaysia are refusing to pay new tolls that Iran is demanding.
The whole situation is so fragile that you have experts openly warning that if this goes on, it could trigger a global recession, maybe even a depression.
And this brings us to the core problem here. The U.S. and its allies are looking for an exit, but it doesn't look like they've achieved their original goals. And now Iran is in a position to make some really firm demands.
This table really shows you the gap between the ambition and the reality. The stated goals for the U.S. were pretty clear: stop nuclear enrichment, end the ballistic missile program, stop support for proxies in the region, and maybe even achieve regime change. But according to the analysis in our source material, every single one of those objectives has failed.
So, with what they see as the upper hand, Iran has laid out its own terms to de-escalate. They want financial reparations for all the damages, they want official recognition of their sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz, and they want everyone to accept their right to charge tolls for ships to pass through. These are not small requests. We're talking about fundamental shifts in the regional balance of power.
And that leaves us with the final critical question. You've got one side with a list of unmet objectives looking for an honorable way out, and you've got the other side with a list of non-negotiable demands, and they're backing it up with control over a vital economic artery for the entire world. So with the global economy hanging in the balance, is there any path away from the brink?